Hey guys, welcome to the basic tutorial for LRTimelapse 6. In this tutorial, you learn how to process a simple time-lapse sequence from the beginning until the rendered video clip. So we are going to use Lightroom to edit so-called keyframes. It will calculate all the intermediary images. We are going to smoothen out everything via the visual deflicker and then export and render the final video. So let's get started in LRTimelapse 6. First of all, every time-lapse sequence needs to go into one specific folder, as I did this here. If you have already launched LRTimelapse 6, you might recognize this sequence. That's the splash screen of LRTimelapse 6, and we are going to edit this together now. So by clicking on this folder, I loaded the sequence into LRTimelapse, and you will instantly see a table with every single image displayed here along with some metadata. Metadata is, for example, the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO, but also the date of capture, the file name, and the interval, where we can see here that this sequence has been shot with 4 seconds interval between the single images. On the left, you see a preview, which you can also play back right after loading the sequence. Here you can see a nice transition from the landscape that lies in the shadow and then transitions to a sunlit landscape in the morning. Of course, we will have to do some color adjustments in order to make this really nice. On the upper part here, you have the workflow buttons. The workflow buttons are there to simplify working with LRTimelapse. Basically, you'll always use them from left to right, and that allows you to easily remember what to do in which order. So we'll start with the Keyframes wizard. Keyframes are anchor images. Those are the images that we are going to edit later in Lightroom. So by clicking on the Keyframes wizard, you will get a suggestion for a number of keyframes by LRTimelapse, and you can easily modify this number by dragging the slider. To know how many keyframes you would need, you should just check the sequence and see where you see bigger changes. In this case, I think at the beginning, of course, we would need a keyframe, then in the middle, and then one at the end. So we are going to use 3 keyframes in this case. The next button is called Holy Grail Wizard. This will only be activated when you have shot your sequence according to the Holy Grail approach, which I will explain in another tutorial. The Holy Grail approach of shooting time-lapse involves shooting in M mode and changing your camera settings while recording the time-lapse in order to do a transition from day to night or night to day. In this case, I shot the sequence in M mode, but didn't change the camera settings. As you can see here in the table, they are constant. So now the next step would be save, which has now saved the metadata for the images. The metadata is the description of the edits that we already did, which will be read by Lightroom later. And this metadata, those are small XMP files that are being created. Those are the interface between LRTimelapse and Lightroom. So the next step here now indicates that we need to drag this sequence to Lightroom in order to import it there. So we just click here on this button. We will drag it down to the taskbar and open up Lightroom, which will come up. Here you need to make sure that Lightroom has been opened before and is in library mode. That's really important, because otherwise you won't be able to drop this now. If I release the mouse button now, it will automatically open the Lightroom importer with this sequence. And now it's really important that you take care that this is set to add here, because the sequence is already on your hard drive or SSD. You wouldn't want to copy it, which would happen if this was selected. You just would like to add it to the Lightroom catalog, because otherwise Lightroom and LRTimelapse wouldn't be able to communicate. After making sure that add is selected, we just click on import. And this will bring the sequence into Lightroom. Usually it ends up here in this collection current import. Later for exporting, we are not supposed to be on this collection. So what we do now is right click here and go to folder in library. This will just change the selection here to the folder itself. And now we have the whole sequence here, and you can see that the keyframes are marked with 4 stars. So now we check our filters here, and we can set a filter to LRT keyframes. By the way, all those filters, the export plugin for Lightroom, and also the script that we are going to see in a moment have been installed automatically when you installed LRTimelapse and will be part of your Lightroom. So now we see only the keyframes here, and we can start editing the keyframes as you know it from your regular photo editing. So we are going to use the first keyframe and go to Develop module. And now you can do your basic edits. You can set the exposure. We can work with the contrast by using highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. Of course, we are going to deal with the white balance, especially when doing such transitions in time-lapse. It's nice to have white balance transition as well, because here the sun comes up, then as we have the progression to the day, we'll get cooler colors, of course, and this looks nice in time-lapse. Another thing that we can of course use also when working with LRTimelapse are the masks in Lightroom. And when you activate this mask feature, now this is Lightroom 11 already, and the latest Lightroom Classic, which currently is 11, introduced a new kind of masks. LRTimelapse will automatically convert old sequences to the new format and also, of course, initialize your sequences with the new masks if you are working with Lightroom Classic from 11 upward. Just make sure to use the predefined masks. Here you have 4 masks for linear gradients and you have 2 masks for circular gradients, and then those 3 masks here are only for internal use, so please don't use them, just leave them alone. So in this case we are going to use one of these linear masks here, it's mask 2, then we can just rotate it and use it to light up the ground a little bit here, and we could also use another mask from the top to bring down the exposure for the sky a little bit. These masks can also be animated, so if you move them as you progress through the editing of the keyframes, then you also will get a nice smooth transition afterwards after calculating the transitions in LRTimelapse, and those masks will also move then. One important thing when working with masks is that you don't add additional masks and don't remove from those masks that are predefined. So just leave the amount of masks constant, then you can just work on the masks that are predefined, because only those masks will be edited and animated in LRTimelapse. After finishing the editing of the first keyframe, you just hold Ctrl and click on the second one. On Mac it would be Command and click to just select the second one, and as usually in Lightroom you will have the first image most selected and the second one a little bit less selected, which you can see are these colors. And when you apply the sync script here, then the settings from the most selected will be migrated to the less selected image. The reason that we use this script instead of the native Synchronize in Lightroom or the copy-paste feature in Lightroom is that this script will preserve any former LRTimelapse edits. For example, the initialization and the Holy Grail wizard. Those are things that otherwise could be destroyed if you just use the native Lightroom tools. So I'd recommend to use the script whenever possible to bring the settings from one keyframe to the other. So now we are going to continue editing the second keyframe, and that's of course only the changes that we are going to do. We are just making the white balance a little bit cooler here. We can increase the exposure a little bit to show that it gets brighter. Then we can decrease the blacks a little bit. And by the way, if you edit here in the Develop module in Lightroom, just take care to not exaggerate those contrast sliders here, and also be careful with dehaze and clarity. If you do too much, Lightroom will introduce nasty effects because those sliders have kind of an intelligence. They will work context sensitive. And with time-lapse that could lead to a nasty contrast flicker, which is really hard to impossible to remove. Just remember to not drag the sliders all the way, or use the tone curve if you have stronger contrast adjustments to make, because the tone curve usually behaves less context sensitive. Now I'm going to select the second image first, then again with Control or on Mac Command click, select the last one, again do the Sync Keyframe script, and now just do the changes to the last image. Now the ground here is very bright because of the gradient that we used before, so I'm going to open up my mask, select this gradient and just pull down the exposure here a bit, and also we can just move the position a little bit in order to show you that this also will get animated. Okay, of course you can do more, but just to show you, I think that's enough. After finishing editing your keyframes, it's important that you go back to the library. We are going back to grid view now by pressing G key. Now you select all the keyframes. You can do that by selecting the first and then shift selecting the last one, or just by pressing Command A on Mac or Control A on Windows. Then you will have all the keyframes selected. And now you go to Metadata, Save Metadata to Files. It's important that you do this from grid view, because if you do it from Develop, you won't save the metadata for all files, even if all files are selected. That's a nasty little thing in Lightroom, so that's really important. Go to Library before doing the save or read metadata operations. So now we saved those interface files for LRTimelapse, and we can go back to LRTimelapse in order to calculate the transitions. In LRTimelapse you can see that LRTimelapse already reloaded the keyframes. You can see that, for example, this yellow curve has some peaks here, and the yellow curve is the exposure curve. You can see that here exposure is also yellow. That's the curve that will be shown as default. The next step would be, after coming from Lightroom, to do the auto transition. You click on this and LRTimelapse will calculate the metadata for all in-between images and show you those curves. Now, for example, for the exposure, we have a nice transition here. And also you can see that for the other curves, when you click on all here, you can see different curves, and in the table you will also see the columns only for the tools in Lightroom that you really animated, where you changed the settings. And in this case that was exposure, of course, it was white balance temperature, it was blacks, and it was the position of the mask and the exposure of the second mask. The other tools could also have been edited, but if the values stay the same, they are not going to be displayed here. LRTimelapse 6 now automatically creates the visual previews for the whole sequence. And the visual previews, in contrast to the camera previews, are the previews that are already developed with our edits. And now when you play back, this is already the edited sequence that you can see, and you can judge if that is already perfect for you, or if not, do some changes. In this case, it already looks very nice. Let's have a look at this pink curve. The pink curve is the luminosity curve of the developed images. And you can see there are small little bumps in this curve, and this is called flicker. It's not really much and you barely can see it when playing back, but it's still there here, for example, in the sky. So we are going to remove this as a next step. And before applying Deflicker, I'd always recommend to set a reference area. A reference area would be an area of the images which will be used to detect flicker. So that ideally would be an area where you have isolated the flicker effects. In this case, we are setting the reference area to this part, which is only sky and a little bit of the mountain. And as you can see now, the pink curve will be calculated only from this area. And that means, for example, the dark shadows here are not present in this area, and that's why you don't see that S-shaped curve that we had before, the shadows here, and then at the end it went bright. You only see the brightness progression in the sky. So this reference area is also valuable for you to judge the overall brightness progression of your sequence without having such effects like the shadows here on the mountain. So now let's activate the visual deflicker, and here you have a smoothing slider, which is the most important thing. If that would be 0, the curve wouldn't be smooth at all, so we would follow all the bumps here. But if you drag it up, you can see the more you drag it, the smoother the curve gets. So this smoothing slider should be set to just follow the global change in brightness, but just remove the flicker effects from the curve. So the green curve is what we would like to have, the pink curve is how it is currently. And now here you have the option to do either a single pass of deflicker or directly do a multi-pass deflicker, which would just do 2 or 3 times or even more times the deflicker, one after each other, to gradually remove those effects. In this case, let's just do a 2-pass multi-pass deflicker, and then we click on apply, and you will see LRTimelapse will only calculate the visual previews for those images that have a deviation from this green curve. All of them that are already perfectly aligned won't be recalculated. And the good thing here is that all of those calculations will happen in a lossless way. So you can basically do 100 passes of deflicker, which doesn't make sense, but you wouldn't have any sacrifice in quality, because this is all mathematical stuff that happens in background, and only when we export from Lightroom, when we do the rendering of our video, only then all of the edits will be applied all together to the sequence, and this means you will get the maximum possible quality when working with LRTimelapse. So while we watch the deflicker happening here, you can already see that the pink curve is aligned with the green curve. Now it's getting closer and closer the more deflicker passes you do, but also there is an end eventually, because when the pink curve is totally flat, then nothing will happen anymore, because LRTimelapse detects that and don't redevelop the visual previews then. So this already looks very nice. Let's play it back. I will detach the preview here to get a bigger player. Now let's play it back and see how it looks. And that looks perfect. Great. Now you have 2 options. You could either export and render directly in LRTimelapse with some limitations in terms of quality, or you could do the export from Lightroom, which will give you all the options in terms of quality. The first approach would be clicking on this export and render button, and it would ask you for the folder where you would like to put your finished time-lapse into. I recommend to have them separated from the original file, so I will use this time-lapse done folder here. Now you get the export dialog, which we will talk about in a moment, and you can just do export and render. But you will also have a warning here that the intermediary sequence and the exported image files that we will first create before rendering the video will always be JPEG, 8-bit and Rec 709. That means for some more professional users, kind of a limitation. They would like to go to Lightroom to do the export there with a white gamut and with TIFF intermediary files and so on. But for many of you, this might also be okay. Nevertheless, I would like to show you the way via Lightroom now in this tutorial, and then you can decide if you do the direct way or if you would like to go via Lightroom. After coming back from Lightroom, we'll end up here also, and I will show you how this render dialog works. So if you want to export from Lightroom, which I recommend, you would go to Lightroom. Now here we already have indicators telling us that the metadata was changed externally. Now, of course, we need to read the metadata for the whole sequence into Lightroom. Go to Filters, we go to Full Sequence, and currently we have the keyframes edited here and this image is not edited yet. So now we select the whole sequence with Ctrl A or Command A on Mac, do metadata, read metadata from files, and this will bring all our edits, including Deflicker and everything, into Lightroom, and then we can go to export. On the left you will have LRTimelapse presets. Just click on this preset. JPEG 4K, for example, would create intermediary files as JPEGs with a maximum resolution of 4K. This is not necessarily the resolution you are going to render your video in, but it will be a limit and it would create a little bit smaller intermediary sequences that you can use if you would only render up to 4K nevertheless. JPEG Original would create the JPEG files in the original size, and then for the more advanced users you could also use TIFF 8-bit or TIFF 16-bit in the LRTimelapse Pro version. In this case, let's do JPEG 4K, and here you'd also need to provide the output path. Again, the same as before in LRTimelapse, what I explained, just use a path that is separated from your original files, and this is the path where the intermediary sequences and the rendered video will end up. Okay, let's click on export. Now that Lightroom finished exporting the sequence, it automatically called LRTimelapse and the render dialog came up. And this is the same render dialog that you already saw before. The only difference is that before we had this option activated, export and render current sequence, and now we have this option activated, render pre-exported intermediary sequence from Lightroom. So let's check out the render dialog. In the top part now, this is new in LRTimelapse 6, we have render presets. For your convenience, now you can just choose a render preset with all the video settings. This is especially useful for people that are not so familiar with video rendering settings. So there's a couple of presets and you can also create your own presets. So for example, if you want to render a standard video in full HD 1080p, then you can just select the upper preset. Then you will have a H.264 MP4 codec, which is quite default. You will have an output size of full HD and quality will be medium, 29.97 frames per second, which is also kind of a default. Everything will be set for maximum compatibility with players with the upper two presets. But you can also change these presets for your demands or even add new presets. For example, if you would like the quality to be very high for this preset, you can just change this. Then you will see that changed indicator, and after clicking here on update the selected render template, you will have this change applied to the preset. Or you can also add a new preset just by changing something, for example creating a H.264 preset and then clicking on plus. Then it will tell you that you need to change the name here, and now you can just add this preset, which then would appear here in the table. In the upper part here you can see that the export dialog shows the task. This is the intermediary sequence that Lightroom created. Those intermediary sequences always begin with LRT_. You know that it's an exported sequence from Lightroom. The file name will also be generated automatically and it reflects the settings that you have set here. In this case now you see H.265, 420 color sampling, Rec 709 and so on. So that if you change any settings, you will get another file name. And this is especially useful because you can re-render your exported intermediary files at any time from here and save a lot of time by doing so. For example, if you just want to use a different setting here, just change the setting and re-render this sequence without going all the way from Lightroom, etc. and you will have a different file name here, which would make it easy to locate those files later when using them for editing or playback. Speaking about the motion blur, this is a very nice feature which would do an additional smoothing to your sequence by cross-fading adjacent images into each other, and the number of images that are cross-faded is reflected by the number of the motion blur setting here. So in this case, for example, 5 images would be transitioned into each other and leading to a very smooth result. Of course, if you have fast pans in your time-lapse or very fast movements, you might get a little bit of ghosting then in the results. If you experience that, this means the motion blur setting has been too high for that sequence, then just lower it or turn it off for such a sequence. Then also you can force the aspect ratio here to be 16:9, which will be the default for video files and which will also increase the compatibility with video players. So if you experience that your video player is not capable of playing back the rendered videos, then most likely it would help to just force the aspect ratio to 16:9 and re-render the sequence. You can also change the position of the crop here, and now as of LRTimelapse 6 you can also choose different aspect ratios which also can be rendered directly from LRTimelapse. In this case we are going for 16:9 and set the crop to the bottom here, and I always recommend to set sharpen, have show in Explorer or Finder selected here, and this will highlight the exported video then directly in your file system after finishing the rendering. Okay, let's just render this video. This will put the render task here into the batch section in LRTimelapse. You could now open the render dialog again and choose to render another intermediary sequence which would put this into the batch task here also, and then render one after the other. After finishing rendering our video, now you get the Explorer with this file. So now playing it back, you can see that the result is very nice and smooth. So that was the big workflow, including Lightroom, which will give you all the options for editing and all the options for rendering with the highest possible quality. Of course, there are abbreviations to this workflow. I will make another tutorial where I show how to use LRTimelapse standalone to do some simple edits, but of course that would be limited. So my recommendation is always to have Lightroom Classic and use that for the raw file editing, because that's the powerful raw editor that will always be in background when you work with LRTimelapse. Thank you very much for watching this tutorial. I wish you a lot of fun experimenting with your own time-lapse sequences with LRTimelapse and Lightroom. If you have any questions, come to the LRTimelapse forum under forum.lrtimelapse.com. I will be there to help you. If you have any suggestions for improvements, if you find any glitches or bugs, of course, let me know there. So see you in the forum. Bye bye. If you like the video, leave me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in more information about LRTimelapse and time-lapse photography in general. See you.